The American Civil War, an overview. There's so much to learn about the American Civil War. There were over 10,000 engagements, including over 150 major battles fought between the North and South in 24 states over the course of 4 years. Modern estimates revised in the past decade suggest around 750,000 deaths. That was 2% of the US population in the 1860s, and it would be equivalent to us fighting a war amongst ourselves today that killed 6.5 million people. This short lecture will only scratch the surface of this incredibly fascinating time in American history. Before we jump into the war, let's do a quick review of the causes. The main cause of the war, of course, was slavery. Needed, or at least believed to be needed in the South, and more and more disliked in the North, by the North. Part of that North-South back and forth had to do with the sectionalism of the country, the idea that people really had a loyalty to their area of the country. And we saw this even as entrenched in the politics as in the U.S. Senate, where 3 senators, John Calhoun of the South, Henry Clay of the West, and Daniel Webster of the North, fought constantly over government policies that were best for their area of the country. One of the final straws, of course, was the election of 1860. This was the election when Lincoln became president. And you may remember that he did so without winning a single state in the South. So, excuse me. So the states were worried, the southern states were worried about this, not only because it indicated their lack of political power, but because Lincoln was known to dislike slavery. And though he hadn't said he was going to abolish it throughout the nation, there was certainly a worry that he would. All of these causes, along with the others you've been looking at recently, led to secession, right? Led to states breaking away from the United States of America and forming their own government called the Confederate States of America. Once those first 7 states seceded and set up a government for their new nation, the South demanded, this new country, the Confederate States of America, demanded that the U.S. turn over all government-owned property in the seceded states, including military outposts and forts. Lincoln refused to do this, so the South decided to make an example of one of them. And the one they chose was Fort Sumter, which was out in the mouth of the harbor of the city of Charleston in South Carolina. The South chose to make an example of it, right? And so you can see the red lines on the map there. The South fired on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter sat on an island out in the middle of this harbor, and there was really nothing they could do. They couldn't get resupplied. They had to surrender the fort and evacuate it. There were no casualties in this battle, but it did show that the South intended to fight. They were not going to come easily, I guess, back into the fold. They were not going to be dissuaded from their secession. And the Battle of Fort Sumter has come to be known as the first battle in the American Civil War. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video here, and on a piece of blank paper or in a Google Doc, type up, write up, or draw up some notes to summarize the information this video has covered so far. It's mostly been a review, but still, let's just solidify it in your mind by doing that. Go ahead and pause the video. Take the time to make sure things are in your own words and or hand-drawn, and then restart the video when you are ready to move on. So once the war had begun, after that battle at Fort Sumter, states continued to take sides. Four more states seceded, bringing the total number in the Confederacy, or the South, or the Confederate States of America, to 11. Those are the states you see in red on this map. Okay? The blue and yellow states together were still the United States of America, or the North, as they're known, even though you can see some of them are in the West, or also the Union, this would be called, right? Now, the reason why some of them are yellow and not blue, even though those states are all on the same side, is that the yellow states are what is known as border states. A border state was a state that allowed slavery, but that did not secede. So many of the slave-holding states seceded, but not all of them. The black areas or gray areas on this map are current states that were at the time not states. They were territories still. So that's why they are technically on neither side, although certainly men from both of those areas could have gotten involved in the war on either side. So each side had some advantages and disadvantages heading into the war. The North, one of their main advantages was population. There were 22 million people in the North versus 9 million in the South. And of those 9 million in the South, 4 million of them were enslaved and not likely to be given weapons to be allowed to fight. So we're looking at, quite a discrepancy in the number of soldiers that could be drawn in both areas. Also, wealth and industry were concentrated in the North. 90% of the manufacturing was done in the North, giving them a leg up on making things like weapons or uniforms during the war. There were more than 2 times as many banks in the North as in the South. The North also, although it was not heavily agricultural, at least its economy wasn't based on agriculture like the South was, what the North was growing was food, right? It was the breadbasket states growing grain, that sort of thing. So they're not growing cash crops like cotton, which is not going to be that useful in fighting a war. They're growing food that their people can eat. The North also has about 2/3 of the country's railroads. It has the Navy, the United States Navy, because they, of course, stay with the United States. It has an organized army already as well. That's a lot of advantages for the North, but that's not to say that the South didn't have some advantages as well. One of the biggest advantages the South had was motivation. I mean, they were fighting. They felt for a way of life that was being stripped away from them. They were fighting for traditions. They were fighting for what they believed were their rights. And in their minds, this was very much like the Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, right? Where a government had become unjust and was oppressing part of its country, and so that part was breaking away, much like America had done many years before from Britain. The South is also at an advantage because they're fighting a defensive war, right? They can just sort of wait out the North. They have seceded. They have set up their own government. They have what they want. So unless the North can force them to come back into the United States, they've won, right? So they're on the defense, which can be easier. The South is also a vast area. There's a lot of open land. There's a lot of coast. And so it was a large area for the North to try to gain control over. And one last advantage the South had was military leadership. Robert E. Lee, who's pictured in the bottom right there, was a mastermind. And many of the men in the South were the better military leaders, also better soldiers, right? If you think of the way of life in the South, these were people, and men especially, who would have been more likely to have handled guns, been on horses, those sorts of things, as opposed to more city dwellers in the North, right? One interesting note about Robert E. Lee before we leave this slide, Not only was he one of the biggest assets to the South, but he was not actually in favor of slavery, nor was he in favor of secession. But demonstrating that idea of sectionalism, he was a Virginian. He was from Virginia. And when Virginia voted to secede, he said he could not possibly imagine picking up arms against his brothers in Virginia. So he chose to give up his commission in the United States military and lead the Confederate military instead. Now, there were some strategies that each side had, and I've kind of already mentioned the South's, right? It was simple. It was to defend what they had taken with them when they seceded and to just outlast until the North got tired of fighting. The North had a little bit more complicated three-part strategy called the Anaconda Plan. Part one of the Anaconda Plan was to put up a blockade. So you kind of see that going around the coast here, right? And the idea of that is to make it harder to move troops and supplies around, but more importantly, to keep cotton from being exported and to keep manufactured goods from being imported. About the only use cotton could have for the South during the war was if it provided them money, if they could sell it. But a blockade is going to make that difficult to do, and so it's going to make it difficult for the South to keep up its economy during the war. Part two of this Anaconda Plan was to take the Mississippi River, gain control of the Mississippi River. You can see that, again, that would disrupt shipping in the South, but it also would divide the South. Some of the states that seceded were west of the Mississippi, and some of them were east of the Mississippi River. And so if you can sort of divide and conquer, make it difficult for those two halves to function together, that would make it easier for the North to win the war. And then the third part of the Anaconda Plan was to capture Richmond, which was the capital city of the South. So the early fighting, of course, was in 1861. We know about Fort Sumter here in the harbor of Charleston, right? We see the blockade beginning to be set up in 1861, but not yet solid. And then there are many skirmishes after Fort Sumter. It's going to be another few months, though, until July of 1861 before the next real major battle. This was the first Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. And a quick side note here, the battles in the Civil War will often be named, will often have two names. And this is because the North, being unfamiliar with the land, tends to name the battles or refer to the battles based on geography. So in this instance, Bull Run is a stream near where this battle was fought. But the South tends to name more after I guess, civilization pieces, right? So cities, towns, that sort of thing. So Bull Run up here, also called Manassas. Manassas was the name of a big railroad station near where this battle was fought. So this is the first battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. This battle occurred because the Union was heading for Richmond, right? They're trying to set up their blockade. They're heading out west doing, you see a little bit of fighting towards the Mississippi, and they're going to try to take over the capital. The North at this time thinks it's going to be an easy win and it's going to put an end to the rebellion. And we know this, it's evidenced because when Lincoln called for men to enlist in the military at the beginning of the Civil War, he asked for them to enlist for 4 months. He thought that was going to be plenty long enough to conquer the South and put down this rebellion. We also know that people thought this was going to be an easy win because as the troops were heading out of Washington, D.C., marching towards Bull Run. They were being followed by citizens from Washington, D.C. with their picnic baskets who went out to watch the battle. Like, everybody thought this was going to be a grand hurrah. However, there was a woman, Rose Greenhow, who was a D.C. widow, a widow who lived in Washington, D.C., and she favored the South and their cause. And she learned of the plans and warned the South. She was a spy, and she sent word to the South. So the South, was able to cut the North off before they got to Richmond. Hence, they met up outside Bull Run. And unfortunately for the North, this was anything but an easy win. There's multiple engagements, and the South really stood firm and intimidated the inexperienced soldiers in the North. There were almost 5,000 casualties in this Southern victory, and this battle really showed that victory for either side is not going to be quick or easy. As the war continued into 1862, the North's blockade is beginning to work. We're getting fewer supplies imported, cotton not being sold to Europe at the same level for sure. But then in the North is still fighting for control of the Mississippi. You can see in this map here that they're making some gains. You can see they've got blue land right up to here. This blue land has come under Northern control, and this land here has come up to Northern control. But there's still a vast stretch of Mississippi River that is not, that still belongs to the South, right? So they cannot seem to gain that piece of the plan just yet, okay? You can see as well from the map that a number of major battles occur in 1862, the North doing better on the war in the West, including a key victory at Shiloh, but struggling much more in the East around Richmond. Because the South is doing well, in September 1862, General Lee of the South, abandons the defensive idea and instead goes on offense. And what he's doing is hoping to attack into the North here and convince Maryland, which is one of those slave-owning border states, to also secede. That would mean that Washington, D.C. was surrounded by states that had seceded. So this offensive move of Lee's leads to the Battle of Antietam, also called Sharpsburg, which is the town near there. And in a reversal of what happened at First Bull Run, the Union learns of Lee's plans this time. The North learns of the South's plans and is prepared for this attack. Antietam, up here, ends up being the bloodiest single day of the war. 23,000 plus casualties, including almost 5,000 people killed. That was more than in the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War combined. So this is shocking death toll for this day and age. And though the South withdraws, it's not really a victory for either side. Later that same year, the North suffers one of its worst defeats at Fredericksburg. This is in December of 1862. 6 times the North charges at the South's line, and 6 times they're driven back. And when the year ends, the end of the Civil War is just nowhere in sight still. So we've covered sides, advantages, strategies, and a bit about the fighting during the first 2 years of the war. That's a lot of information. So this would be a good spot to stop, pause the video here, and add some more to your notes. All right, as we've seen, the first 2 years of the war did not go very well for the North. We know, though, that the North eventually won because all of those states in the South are now once again part of the United States, right? So how did that happen? How did the North pull a victory out of this war that was not going well for them during the first couple of years? We're going to take a look at some key turning points that happened during the year of 1863. The first major turning point was the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a declaration made by President Lincoln in September of 1862, just after the North's sort of victory that I just was telling you about at Antietam. This timing was important because Lincoln didn't want the Emancipation Proclamation to seem like a desperate measure. He wanted it to be announced on the heels of a victory. What did this declaration say? Well, to emancipate means to free. So the Emancipation Proclamation freed people, specifically slaves, and the way it was worded was, in any state whose people shall be in rebellion against the U.S. So in other words, this does not apply to slaves in the border states that stayed with the Union, only in rebelling states. Okay? It doesn't free those in Union-controlled territory. Obviously, the people in the Confederate-controlled territory are going to ignore it. They're like, that's a lovely proclamation, President Lincoln, but you're not our president. Our president is Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America, so we don't really care about your proclamation. So why would Lincoln make this Emancipation Proclamation if no slaves were actually going to be freed? Well, it did have a lot of important impacts. Mainly, it changed the reason for fighting the war. When Lincoln began the war, when America began the war and began the fight to reclaim the seceded states, Lincoln said, this is a war to preserve the Union. This is a war to keep our country together, not this is a war to end slavery. But the Emancipation Proclamation makes it clear now that slavery is going to be ended if the North wins this war. This renews Northern support for this war, which had been waning. People were not excited about this war that's dragging on forever, that is killing tens and hundreds of thousands of people, that is costing so much money, that is forcing a draft by this time. People are being drafted and forced to fight even if they're not interested in it. But when they know it's for the abolitionist cause, there are many more people willing to continue the fight. And because this puts North clearly on the side of abolition, this also wins the North some favor in Europe. Slavery has already been ended, has already been abolished throughout most of Europe at this time, and so this kind of ensures that now that this is truly a war between the abolitionist North and the slave South, it means Britain and France are not going to jump in and support the South. And there was some worry that that could happen if they decided they wanted the South's cotton bad enough. So this kind of cuts the South's popularity with Europe. Another key turning point during 1863 was the Battle of Gettysburg. We're going to look a lot closer at this battle next week, so for now I'll just tell you a quick little bit about it. Gettysburg is a town in Pennsylvania, so it's in the North. It's another time that Lee is on the offensive. He's invading the North. He's had a lot of victories, as we know, in 1861 and 62. He's feeling confident. He's trying to gain support of Britain and France and show that the South has a good chance of winning. So he decides to go on the offense up into the North. This ends up being a 3-day battle involving over 165,000 soldiers. And in the end, almost a third of them are casualties, including over 7,000 deaths. But it is a victory for the North, a huge victory for the North. It is the farthest north that the Southern forces ever reach. It's the farthest into the United States that the Southern forces ever get. And it's going to end up being the last time that the South ever invades the North. They go back to their defensive strategy after this. Another key element of Gettysburg being a turning point comes much later in the year. In November of 1863, there's a national cemetery dedicated here to bury many of the dead from this battle, the Union dead, and Lincoln speaks at this dedication. He makes the Gettysburg Address, which you'll also look at a little more next week. I'll suffice it to say that stirs many people on, remotivates them, gets people fired up again about this war. So a lot of reasons why Gettysburg is a turning point. You'll know more next week. And a final key turning point was the fall of Vicksburg. As you can see from the map on the left, Vicksburg is a town on the Mississippi River. By the time we get into mid-1863, the Union has control of most of the Mississippi River, but not this town. And so everyone recognizes the importance of this town of Vicksburg. The Confederate president, the Southern president, Jefferson Davis, says Vicksburg is the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together. And U.S. President Abraham Lincoln says Vicksburg is the key. This war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. So both sides recognize Vicksburg and really holding the Mississippi River as so important. Now, at this time, Ulysses S. Grant had not yet been put in charge of the entire Northern Army, but he was a Northern general in charge out west. And his strategy for Vicksburg was to lay siege. A siege is a military operation in which forces surround an area, and so they cut off essential supplies, food, ammunition, those sorts of things, and hope to force a surrender. So if you look in the sort of zoomed in map, you can see Grant and the blue Union forces here laying siege around the protective walls that the South has built around Vicksburg. The Siege of Vicksburg begins on May 18th of 1863, and it lasts over 6 weeks, but it works. On July 4th, just one day after the North's victory at Gettysburg, Vicksburg falls to Union troops. The North gains control of the Mississippi River, so they have now split the South in 2 pieces, restricting the movement of troops and goods and communication information in the South. So together, all of these things, the Emancipation Proclamation, the victory at Gettysburg, the fall of Vicksburg and the Mississippi River, the Gettysburg Address later in the year. These are all things that happened during 1863 that are going to turn the tide of the war. So this is another good place to pause the video and catch up on your notes. And be sure to capture information about all 3 key turning points that occurred during 1863. After his key victory at Vicksburg, Grant was put in charge of the entire Northern Army. Lincoln promotes him. And his strategy, Grant's strategy, is known as total war. Total war means destroying everything that could possibly be useful to the war effort. This is different from what was happening before, because what was happening before was soldiers fought soldiers, destroyed things that other soldiers might need. Total war means destroy everything that could in any way possibly be useful to the war effort. So if you walk through a country field and there are crops being grown there, you burn them, even if they're just owned by a random civilian farmer, right? And Grant's serious about this strategy. He tells his generals, Sheridan and Sherman, who he sends off to carry out this plan of total war, leave nothing to invite the enemy to return. Destroy whatever cannot be consumed. Let the valley be left so that crows flying over it will have to carry their rations along with them. Right? Think about that. Leave the land that you walk through in such a state that birds will not be able to find food there. Okay, he is talking total destruction. And you can see from the pictures what some of the destruction looked like, right? Buildings were destroyed, crops were burned, livestock was killed, fires were set and used to melt railroad track that the South had remaining. As I said, it wasn't Grant himself who carried out this strategy, although it was his idea and his command. But it was Generals Sheridan and Sherman who carried this out in a path called Sherman's March to the Sea. And you can see the route they took in the map in the upper right, and sort of all through the South, especially through Georgia, through Atlanta. That's where the 2 pictures are from, actually, and on towards Savannah. And then once they've sort of destroyed that whole swath, they're going to start heading north, where they're eventually going to meet up with Grant up near Richmond. In addition to causing destruction throughout the South, total war also works with the idea that the North can afford to lose more soldiers than the South can. It was bloody and nasty business, but Grant's thought was the North has many more people. If the death tolls are about the same on both sides, the North is going to be able to continue replenishing its soldiers, while the South is eventually going to run out of soldiers. So it's a decisive action, but it is bloody action. Meanwhile, as Sherman's march to the sea is taking place, Grant is going after Richmond, the final piece in that Anaconda Plan, right? Remember by this time, the blockade is in place, the Mississippi River has fallen, and the last piece is to capture the capital of Richmond. You can see the troop movements on the map with the Union blue lines kind of dancing around the city of Richmond, and the Lee's, southern red lines attempting to hold them off. The turning point in this campaign was undoubtedly April 2nd, 1865, when the city of Petersburg here falls after a 10-month siege, right? Richmond falls that very same day. And when Petersburg and Richmond fall, Lee sends word to Jefferson Davis, I can't hold this land. You need to get out of here. So the government, Jefferson Davis flees. Starting around April 7th, Grant and Lee exchange a series of letters. Grant is asking for surrender, telling Lee your situation looks hopeless. Lee is replying well, I don't know if I'd quite use the word hopeless, but, what kind of terms did you have in mind, just in case we were interested? And these letters go back and forth a number of times as the troops continue to sort of shuffle along after each other, right? Lee's sort of trying to get away. Grant is pursuing. This goes on until April 9th, 1865, when Lee surrenders in a town called Appomattox Courthouse. That is the town name. They were not in a court building, right? Appomattox Courthouse is the town name. The terms of surrender were very generous. As soon as the news of the surrender traveled up and down the lines, the Union soldiers, the Northern soldiers, cheered. They'd won. They cheered. Grant ordered them silent. He said, the war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. And so it's so interesting, this man who was going to, he would go all out in this total war campaign to win. When it was over, it was over. And now we were to treat these people as our countrymen again. So some of the terms of surrender, for instance, soldiers had to turn in their rifles, but officers were allowed to keep their sidearms, their swords and pistols. Soldiers were all allowed to go home. They were just released. If they had brought horses or mules into battle with them, Grant said, take them back home. You're going to need them. It's spring. It's time for planting. Take your horses with you so you can get your farm up and running again. He also fed the South. They were not doing well as far as supplies, and many of the men hadn't eaten in a number of days by April 9th. So before he sent them on their way home, Grant made sure all of them were fed. An interesting side story about this surrender, it happened, you can see in the picture there, in the front parlor. Well, that's a painting. Nobody was actually there taking photos at the time, but it happened in the front parlor of a house of a man named Wilmer McLean. This is interesting because almost 4 years earlier, the first Battle of Bull Run, remember talking about that? The first major battle after Fort Sumter was fought on Wilmer McLean's farm in Virginia. He chose to move his family because he thought, this is crazy. We can't have war going on in our fields and all around our farmhouse all the time. We need to get away from it. So he moved his family. And now, 4 years later, the fighting found him again, and the war ends in his very house. So after these 4 long years, the war is over. We talked about the terms of surrender in general, but just to kind of bring things to closure, what happened to the South's 2 main leaders? Jefferson Davis, who remember was the president, so government leader, Abraham Lincoln's counterpart. He fled Richmond, like I told you, when it fell on April 2nd. And then after Lee surrendered on April 9th, he fled further into the deep South. And it took about a month to track him down and capture him, but it was the 4th Michigan Cavalry who was responsible for that happening. He was indicted for treason, imprisoned and indicted for treason, but he never had a trial. He was never tried. The speculation is that the government was worried that he might be found not guilty. And what do they do if that happens? So there never was an actual trial. About 2 years after he was imprisoned, some people, including wealthy Northerners, raised bail for him. He was released from prison in 1867, and he lived another 20 or so years, dying in December of 1889. Robert E. Lee, our general, main military leader of the South all throughout the war, returned to Richmond, Virginia, which was where he was from after the war. Much like Grant, he had this "we're all in it together again" mindset, right? He said, dismiss from your mind all sectional feeling and bring your children up to be Americans. He never again wore his Confederate uniform. He never again flew a Confederate flag. He was not buried in his military uniform. He had no attachment to those years once the war was over. He did become president of Washington College in September of 1865, so right away, the next fall after the war had ended. But he didn't live very much longer, unfortunately. He had a heart condition all throughout the war, and not too long after the war ended, he died from a massive stroke in October of 1870. And so there you have it, the American Civil War in just a little over a half an hour. As the video comes to a close, remember to revisit your notes one last time to jot some information down about the last year or so of the war. Thank you.